Buenas tardes. David. Oh, still Diaz. Okay. Well, that's off to a really good start. And that's the reason we're doing this panel in English, for which I apologise on behalf of my fellow Anglophones. Sorry about that. We'll try and be clear, concise, and simple. Shall we introduce ourselves?
I'm Ray Naylor. I'm the author of The Mountain and the Sea. If we don't want to do this in English, we can do it in Russian. It's my second language. So if you prefer, I can. Можно по-русски тоже. Or not.
Oh, hi. I'm Ian MacDonald, well known at this festival because I like it and keep coming back, and you haven't scared me off yet. Most recent book out is Hopeland, big fat book, but coming out at this very festival is a deliciously beautiful edition of my novella Time Was, translated by the mighty Christina. So and we'll be launching that tomorrow.
I'm Joe Haldeman. I've written dozens of books. The only one you've read probably is The Forever War, and probably I'm better off that you haven't read the other ones. But but I forgive you if you have, and I shall proceed as if I were a famous science fiction guy.
And yesterday Diego stopped me in the street and said, "Oh, by the way," to me, he said, "You know you're moderating, aren't you?" And then ran off before I could bring him down and punch him in the face until he withdrew that. But there isn't much to moderate, except we're here to talk about the books that made us writers. And I think we could probably extend that beyond books to other media and other genres as well. But we have a depressingly predictable but rather rich age range here of kind of. So I think between us we span a lot of the genre.
Yeah.
But just to kick off the total irrelevance, for me it wasn't. The books were all great. Loved books, but for me it was a friend of the family turned me into a writer. She was basically a district nurse. She ran a community health scheme in Manchester, where I was born, Bess Cotton, and she saw that I liked books, and so she fed the reader in me, and she would buy me books that she thought I would like. And very slowly, over the course of about 10 years, sending me books she thought I would like, she steered my course into becoming a writer today. So in some ways it's the books, but it's also the people who know books and who know you shaped me that way as well.
I'm sure that's certainly true. In my case, it was a woman who was the daughter of a teacher that I had. This was in the 3rd and 4th grade, which I say 10, 11. Not knowing any better, she gave me a stack of science fiction novels. These were the Winston Juveniles. I don't know if that translates at all into your culture, but the Winston Juveniles were a series of young adult science fiction novels, although the term did not exist at the time, I don't think. But it was stories that a person could understand at the age of 10 or 12, and that were set on other worlds and with remarkable circumstances and so forth. She gave me those books, loaned me those books, and then loaned me more. And I got all the way up to Wells, and I saw Heinlein and Clark and that gang as well. And so that one woman changed my life in a very fundamental way. which I did not really appreciate for a few years more. Then I, of course, like the rest of you, I had to read everything else by all kinds of dull people like Kipling and, God, Shakespeare. Oh, no. I don't know if Shakespeare is such a formative influence on you people, but if you grow up in America, Shakespeare is something like the flu. You're going to go through it, and having been exposed to it, you become immunized and never have to go to it again. Oddly, but if you're really bad, if God hates you, you turn into somebody who has to read Shakespeare again and again and fucking again until you wander through the world a strange animated corpse with the memories of all these dead princes telling you what to do. Get out of my way, ghost. Yeah, no, that was a line. But once you get free of that, and of course you never do, you can go about your life and pursue things that have nothing to do with ghosts and princes and so forth. And if you're really advanced, you get into something like engineering or physics, and all those ghosts become animated by electrons and photons and things. And you may become very old without realizing they're the same creatures. If you become mentally ill, they become animated over again, and your own experience in life seems to reinforce what you learned as a child about ghosts and electrons and spaceships and relatives and things like that. If you're extremely lucky, you get to be really old, and you try to rationalize the whole thing into something integrated, and then you enter into a new state of insanity that allows you to teach other people what you've learned. And this is where I am now. As you see me, a poor, shuddering wreck of a thing called a college professor. So I will surrender my possession of the microphone to some other shuddering professor.
All right.
Fess up, come on.
Note to self, do not mention love of Shakespeare. So I think I owe my writing to the responsibility of my mother and the irresponsibility of my father, in somewhat equal portions. So my mother was very interested in the classics, and so I have this sort of unusual position of being the youngest up on this stage, but also having grown up reading not the science fiction that my generation probably should have been reading, but instead like Jules Verne and H.G. Wells, etc., because these were the books that my mother wanted me to read. Her idea of a compromise was, okay, you want to read science fiction, well, you're going to read the classics as I see them of science fiction. You're going to read Frankenstein, you're going to read all of these books. And so I read a lot of Poe and things like that. When I was very young, my mother taught me to read when I was 3. She sort of injected her ambitions into her first child, which parents often do, and then saturated me in these books. And to the extent that when I had my kindergarten interview, which was a sort of tradition in the United States where they try to establish what you knew already going into kindergarten, my mother had me read to them the first page of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea.
I'd have you killed for that.
I know. I poor child. It seems like abuse, right? So I did. To which the interviewers responded, "Oh no. he's not reading that really. He's just memorized it. And my mother said, if my son has memorized the first page of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, he's even smarter than I think he is. Right. So I did skip kindergarten, actually. I went directly into first grade, which was a horrible mistake, and I purposefully failed fifth grade in order to stop having my ass kicked, and learned to keep very quiet about the books my mother was making me read. My father, on the other hand, decided that it was a good idea to take me to see Alien when it came out in the movie theater. I was born in 1976, so you can do the math. And I hid like all over the place in that movie theater, under the seats, trying to get away from this thing. I was terribly afraid of the dark for years after that. I wonder why. And I couldn't get up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom to save my life because I thought this thing was going to come descending on me out of the air ducts of our house. But when I think quite seriously about the things that influenced me as a science fiction writer, I kept trying to think of books, and instead I would think of films. Alien, and especially the first 10 minutes of Alien, which are basically spent in almost total silence, right? In the corridors of the Nostromo, as the ship gradually wakes up because of this distress call that it's received. And you see, screens chattering reflected in a helmet, the little nodding like bird, right? Just shaking with the vibration of the ship. And I think that 10 minutes, and I suggest that if you haven't seen it recently, you go and re-watch it. It might actually be the most terrifying 10 minutes of film ever made. I think that it's actually more frightening than the rest of that film, because it really gives you this incredible impression of isolation in deep space, right? And this real impression of how incredibly far they are from anything else and how fragile their existence really is. And then when the alien comes in and begins wreaking havoc, you really understand the stakes. And in some ways I think it's odd that I didn't become maybe a script writer, because every time I try to think of a novel, I end up with another film. Alien and then Aliens, right, which is a fantastic movie in its own right, although like a completely different genre. Terminator and Terminator 2, probably the superior film is Terminator 2, actually. This incredible, depiction of fatherhood and responsibility. I wanted to be a writer because I really wanted to recreate those atmospheres of those films and do what those films had done to me, which is to just draw someone into a world and pin them there and make them see from the perspective of a totally different person in a totally different world. And although, I think of like these other books, that's just, every time I tried to sort of like make a list, I end up with movies again.
That's interesting. Yep. Visual media. I tend to be a very visual writer. All writers work differently, but the way I do it is I see a scene in my head, and then just move the mental camera around. And I think that's due to being exposed to a lot of visual media as a kid. And is anyone familiar with the works of Jerry Anderson's Super Marionation, Thunderbirds and Stingray? Oh, you have a treasure trove away. Fireball XL5, Joe 90, Captain Scarlet. This is the voice of the Mr. Odds, no? Anyway, Jerry Anderson was British. He also did Space 1999, which had the best spaceship ever in it. But he did these kind of sci-fi series for kids. But because of the budgets, they did them with puppets. Team America World Police is basically a nod to Jerry Anderson's Super Marionation shows. And my mum took me at a very early age and sat me down in front of the television. Thunderbirds was on, International Rescue. Thunderbirds, they had a secret island, Tracy Island, and 5 fabulous flying machines that could go anywhere in the world and rescue people, which is a pretty kind of positive, hopeful thing to do for a sci-fi. Mm. Yeah, they weren't killing aliens, they were rescuing people. And she sat me down and said, "You watch that." And I did. And damn it, that was the gateway drug. That was the first hit is free moment. After that, we had Doctor Who, of course, and then I remember it vividly. Season of Doctor Who ended, and my dad, who kind of liked Doctor Who, was disappointed. And then a trailer came on for this new program that was going to come on in the same slot called Star Trek. Mm. And it was James T. Kirk fighting the Gorn in the trailer, and my dad's eyes lit up. and yet again, right, we're going to sit and watch Star Trek, and by thunder, he was a trekker to the end of his days, my dad. So,
wow.
Yeah, bless him.
Well, you're all relatively blessed. Being a little bit older, or a lot older, depending on who, my first exposure to such things on television was Captain Video. And this is something that, unless you have studied the ancient classics, you've never seen it. But it was a foolish science fiction show about some strange people bouncing around in a spaceship, so low budget that when they had a fire on the set, it was somebody holding a flame, a match, under in front of the camera's lens, and everybody is reacting to it. Oh. And, I'm like 10 years old, and I think, that's just a match. And this is really an interesting educational moment, because the child is saying, can't they see that that's only a match? And the incipient adult is saying, you can fool people this way. I mean, of course they know it's a match, but they know there's a camera, and people who are watching it are supposed to not think that it's a match. I'm going, holy cow, you can fool people this way? And I think that was the beginning of my science fiction education. It wasn't literary at all. Mm-hmm. It was all just in the boob tube. Mm-hmm. And so I had something that Shakespeare and everybody else before him didn't have. I had illusion presented as reality when I was young enough to think there's no difference between the people around me and everything and the people inside that little box. I mean, they're just farther away. Mm. And this is a level of illusion that was denied any writer before the 20th century. I mean, it's just a way, way different world. And we never think about it because it's been integrated into our life so completely that we accept illusion in a way that people who believed in ghosts and demons and such did not, because they didn't have the absolute reality that we're impregnated with. So writers have to be kind of aware of this, but I don't know, if they accept it, it's just another part of the world. Like the ancient Greeks who were writing about other ancient Greeks, sort of believed in the gods, and sort of said, oh shit, that's something you tell kids. Mm-hmm. And yet they wrote around them, and they integrated all of that mythology and everything into the things they were writing, not because they were trying to fool anybody, but because it was part of reality for them. Mm-hmm. And I kind of envy them as a writer.
Yeah, I think, thinking about other influences, I think another huge influence on me, there were sort of two. One was, I used to go to the library a lot, and my mother found sort of different ways of babysitting me during the summer. One was to send me to go sail on this little lake in the middle of our town, and then spend whatever the rest of the time was in the day at the library. and then she would pick me up. So she'd drop me off in the morning. She'd pick me up at about 5 o'clock. And in between, I would sail this little boat around on the lake, and I would eat my lunch and hang out with a couple of friends of mine, and then we would go to the library and get books. And my favorite books for a long time were these choose your own adventure books, right? Because you had, it was a narrative, but then you were also given this choice and this way of, you know, controlling the outcome of the narrative or trying to change the outcome. And from there, I moved into playing Dungeons and Dragons, and I use the term playing really loosely, because what really happened was I got hold of these books at the library, and I would read the books, the Monster Manual, and the Player's Handbook, and the Dungeon Master's Guide and stuff, and kind of just like imagine what I might do with all of these things, but we rarely actually played Dungeons and Dragons. We mostly just spent a lot of time thinking about Dungeons and Dragons and like imagining, you know, what we would do, and then sometimes playing. But we were little kids, and in some ways probably too young to really keep like a campaign going. I mean, I'm talking about I was like 10, right? And I used to go and to the library on Saturday nights, and they had this big Dungeons and Dragons game every week, and I wouldn't play. I would kind of watch the adults play, right? Because they didn't really want this 10-year-old kid in their party making terrible decisions. but what that taught me, I think, was that I could find this like space where I could also control the narrative, right? And I could start thinking about worlds and how you might put all these sort of elements together, these characters and all of those things. And I started writing these stories that were sort of started out as maybe campaign plans for some Dungeons and Dragons game that would never happen because nobody wants a 10-year-old dungeon master either. They just became these sort of descriptive worlds and these ideas, and from there you get this kind of, you learn how to tell stories, right? And so my mom would find these little fragments that I had written and, you know, ask me what I was doing, and I would say, well, I'm just, imagining things. And they weren't complete stories yet. Probably didn't write complete stories until high school, but I think that the role-playing games, what they offered was a space for imagination that was acceptable, where you had the sense that other people were doing this too, and it was okay, to have this like fantasy world. And as I said, when I think back to my childhood, we rarely ever played Dungeons and Dragons. What we did was we walked around and talked about it a lot, right? And kind of imagined what we would do. And I don't know if anyone else has had that experience as well, but the world of role-playing games wasn't really ever about playing the game. It was more about just having access to the world of imagination.
Yeah. Interesting that you're saying about the library hosting a Dungeons and Dragons game. I think that's a very, very healthy thing for libraries to do. What's that old Manic Street Preacher song? A Design for Life, the opening line, libraries gave us power. As a kid, very much that, because I grew up in a smallish town in Northern Ireland. We had one bookshop with a well-curated but quite small science fiction shelf. So if you wanted to read something new, it was the library. And I twigged onto one of the most brilliant bits of kind of marketing ever done. And in those days, Galanx, who are my current publishers, had a very extensive science fiction line. And they published them all in these really dreary, almost universally uniform yellow covers. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But the clever thing was, in a library, you just work your way across all the yellow spines, and you've worked through basically a complete science fiction library inside a library. And I spent years of my life working through the yellow spines in the library. And saved a fortune in books. I remember buying the first, because as I said, I used to get given books by our family friend Bess. The first one I ever bought with a book token. Do you guys have book tokens? It's basically a voucher that you exchange for books and nothing else. Great, for kids it's great. And I took my book token that I got for Christmas, and went to this little Hugh Greer's bookshop in Bangor, and to their well-curated science fiction shelf. And they had Volume 1 and Volume 2 of the Hugo winners, edited by Isaac Asimov. And I bought the first one, which had a green cover. And I opened it up, and there was The Dragon Masters by Jack Vance. And that was I'd read stories, but that was the first story I effectively paid for with my own money. And that was kind of it's still a great story as well. That was the first one I paid for with my own money. So I was well into, I was far into the journey by then. There was no turning back.
Wow. I'm trying to think of what was the first book I ever paid for with my own money. I think it was a science fiction magazine. It's probably Galaxy magazine, and possibly Astounding, which became analog. But I saw them in the drugstore when I was too young to buy them. They didn't allow you to buy magazine fiction if you were under 14 years old or something. And so I just lusted after them because I could see the covers and such, but I could never take one off the stands and read it. And what happened to me could happen to anybody. My teacher in the 4th grade had a daughter who was ancient. She must have been 17, 16 anyhow. And her mother, my teacher, told her about me, this kid who was all about spaceships and aliens and things like that. And she brought me, the younger woman, the girl, brought me a stack of science fiction magazines, books, pardon me. And, partly because she was an older and wiser person at 16, God, that's incredible. And I felt I had to read them. And besides, her mother, my teacher, was standing over this like a huge umbrella of wisdom. And I became an addict. I don't know how else to say it. I lived for those books. And then for the magazines, when I discovered science fiction magazines, I thought, God, where have these all been? It's like discovering the Bible, except it's more interesting and easier to read, and you're not going to hell if you don't read it. Although perhaps you will. I've never been to hell. No, I won't go into that. But it's all. So much of it is around a set of actual volumes. And I could walk into a room and see those immediately. They glow in the dark. They were the Winston juveniles, which probably means nothing to an audience in this country. But Winston was a publisher who became Holt, Reinhardt, and Winston. And they were the main publisher of science fiction back in the 50s. And so I started buying those and asking for them for Christmas and all this and everything. And I wound up memorizing a lot of them because I loved them so much, I wanted to be able to recall them without having them in front of me. And I didn't realize I was training myself to become a science fiction writer, but there you go. That's what it was. And eventually teachers made me read things like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and The War of the Worlds and such that were literature as well as science fiction. And I don't know, the process was complete before I was old enough to analyze myself and what I was doing. But it was absolutely complete by the time I was in high school. And people were trying to turn you into a teacher or an engineer or something useful. Fuck that. I wanted to be at least Tom Corbett Space Cadet. If I couldn't be, eventually the Michael Valentine Smith and master of an interesting world that was superior to the adult world. All these adults who are controlling your life to have the impression that you know more than they do, that the world is transparent to you and opaque to them. Oh man, this is the gift of science fiction and fantasy. It's a gift of power. And I have not recovered. Even though old age seems to have taken me over. I mean, this thing, they didn't give me this as a prize. So here we are, up here in front of a bunch of people.
We have 5 minutes, so we could take some questions from the audience, perhaps. And if not, a hand. Yep, shout.
I have a question, not about the books that made you a science fiction writer, but when you were already a science fiction writer, if you had read a book that you said, this is the thing I want to do in my fiction.
I don't read an awful lot of science fiction because I'm deep down a nasty, shallow and vindictive person. And I will either dislike it and be sneery and catty, that's rubbish, or I will be envious and steal it wholesale. When I'm writing something, I don't read any other science fiction because I kind of want to keep the hands clean and not be influenced. In between, I will read quite a lot. But
Yeah, I've come to recognize that I have a particular kind of mind, and that I'm a very absorptive kind of intellect. You know, everyone has a different way of learning and interacting with the world, and I'm just a sponge. And so I will pull in whatever it is that's around me, and I tend to avoid reading a lot of science fiction because I don't want to become imitative without even being aware of it. And I make a rule of, if anyone ever compares my work to someone else, I won't read that writer, because I don't want to become closer to them if there's already some kind of way of comparing us together. But I would say one of the books that struck me the most recently, and if you haven't read it, I really recommend it, is a book by Cherry Apsley Gerard, who went on one of the expeditions to Antarctica early in the 20th century, called The Worst Journey in the World. It is the most terrifying piece of interstellar, alien adventure and horror that you will ever read, about him and 2 of his fellow scientists, true story, right? In the middle of the Antarctic winter, departing their post and traveling to an emperor penguin colony in order to gather emperor penguin eggs, in order to prove a later disproven, a few years later, scientific theory that eggs went through a series of evolution, you know, and that the emperor penguins were the most primitive of birds. And they ended up gathering 3 of these eggs at huge cost to themselves. It was so cold at one point, and it's an amazing part of the book, that Cherry Apsley Gerard's teeth shattered when he bit into something. It's an extraordinary book. And I wrote a short story, or a novelette actually, called Sarcophagus, which is a finalist for the Theodore Sturgeon Awards, based basically on The Worst Journey in the World. So it's just an extraordinary piece of literature.
Good. Joe?
Great. Well, after that, I'm still feeling my teeth shatter. Well, the big thing that got my imagination was in aggregate the Heinlein juveniles, because it's sort of, I'm not sure why, but it's a consistent sort of point of view with a hectoring teacher telling you what's right and what's wrong. And that's what your life has been when you're 11 or 12 years old. But here is someone who is not a towering physical presence teaching you, but an abstract voice who has been trained to be reinforcing and friendly and useful and all the things that your parents were not, you know? And I think science fiction did that for me and for a lot of people. They were what science fiction in aggregate was what parents are supposed to be. They showed you good and evil and pushed you toward good and sort of gave an overall historical context to the whole problem of what to do next. And I don't know that I've ever recovered from being a victim of this process.
That is a perfect point to end on. We are, alas, out of time. Thank you. Well played.